From their beginning on the Italian island of Sicily, the Mafia, referred to by its members as Cosa Nostra, or Our Thing, came to dominate organized crime in the United States. After its huge success during Prohibition, the Mafia was able to adapt and engage in other activities after the repeal by exploiting gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, and even finding a way into union and political corruption. Its rise to prominence owes as much to the banning of alcohol in America in the 1920s as its ability to keep its operations private and never discuss business with outsiders. That code of silence, known as omertá, was finally broken in 1963, and the first major threat to the organization's secrecy came to light when Joseph Valachi violated his blood oath to acknowledge the Mafia's existence publicly. Valachi's televised trial exposed their rituals and operations to the world, and the world was fascinated. Welcome to Organized Crime Files. Honorable men. To understand the Mafia in America, you must understand the Mafia in Sicily. Until the 19th century, the Mediterranean island of Sicily had its own unique identity. It was a melting pot of nationalities. The Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Normans, and Spanish all had a hand in shaping its character. Sicily was even ruled by the Germanic Vandals and Ostrogoths in the early Middle Ages. A feudal society until the 19th century, it was after General Giuseppe Garibaldi invaded Sicily in 1860 that it was brought under Italian control. Many islanders didn't welcome the Italian invasion, and there were uprisings that the Italian government put down. Petty criminals and bandits took advantage of the chaos. To re-establish order, many of the wealthier citizens employed these former revolutionaries and bandits to protect their properties and businesses. Ironically, the ones who were offering to fix the problems for a price were the ones who were causing the trouble in the first place. It was, as former Gambino family chieftain Louis Ferrante said, a schizophrenic protection racket. This is when we first hear the term Mafia. Gangs of former criminals who considered themselves to be honorable because they were not thieves who used violence to steal. They only used it to defend. They considered themselves to be respectable and above the law. They were men of honor. Soon, those men would emigrate to the United States, and on arrival in New York City, they took the culture of the Sicilian Mafia with them. Southern hospitality. Immigration into America exploded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Poverty, wars, and oppression sent many Europeans across the Atlantic in search of opportunities for a better quality of life and freedom. Around 4 million of those immigrants came from Italy. Many of them were from the south of the country, uneducated and poor. They found that instead of America's streets being paved with gold, the reality was not much better than the impoverished circumstances they had hoped to leave behind. One cultural quality that they all brought with them, whether they were a gangster or a grandmother, was that everyone had the same deep-seated resentment for authority, especially law enforcement. It was a fundamental trait that would help to nurture and build a secretive criminal society because no one ever talked to the police. Contrary to popular belief, the American Mafia did not begin its dealings in New York or even Chicago, but rather in the southern state of Louisiana, deep in the heart of Dixie. The first known Mafia member to emigrate to the US was Giuseppe Esposito. He fled there after he helped to kidnap the son of a wealthy English banking family in Palermo. The young man lost both his ears and a portion of his nose before his family paid the ransom money. Captured by Italian troops, Esposito managed to escape, and fled to the US, first arriving in New York and then making his way to New Orleans. Despite adopting a new identity, Police Chief David Hennessy tracked Esposito down in 1881. He was arrested and extradited to Italy, where he was sentenced to a life in chains. 9 years later, Hennessy was investigating a case that involved two Sicilian families, the Matrangas and the Provenzanos, who were fighting for a contract to unload ships. One New Orleans night in October of 1890, Hennessy, who had received threats to his life, was ambushed and gunned down. Hennessy was the quintessential local cop, tall, handsome, and well-liked in New Orleans, although probably not as clean-handed as he seemed. Investigators found 4 Luparas at the murder scene. The sawed-off shotguns were known as the Mafia gun. Anti-Italian sentiment reached a high and caused the mayor to announce, "Heretofore, these scoundrels have confined their murderings among themselves. None of them have ever been convicted because of the secrecy with which the crimes have been committed and the impossibility of getting evidence from the people of their own race to convict." Bold indeed was a stroke aimed at their first American victim. The mayor ordered the police to arrest every Italian they came across. And soon the jails were full of them. News spread across the country as newspapers alerted American citizens to the threat of a sinister criminal organization. 19 Italian men were indicted for murder, although only 9 were put on trial due to lack of evidence. It should be noted that Hennessy had a special relationship with Provenzano's leader, Joe, and many of his cops alibied the defendants. In March of 1891, after a 2-week trial amid rumors of bribery and witness tampering, 6 men were acquitted, and the jurors were unable to decide on the other 3. The citizens of New Orleans were enraged. A lynch mob of around 6,000 people arrived at the parish jail, led by an attorney named W.S. Parkinson. Those defendants who weren't shot were hanged. When it was over, Parkinson thanked the mob, saying, "God bless you." The Wolf, the Ox, and the Claw. Although some Italian immigrants settled in other cities, many more of them lived together in what were essentially ghettos along New York's Lower East Side. At the start of the 20th century, crime was everywhere across America, but surprisingly, in New York, it was small scale, so far at least. Many Italians coming to the country would be accosted by the street gangs and given a home and a job in return for a percentage of their pay. Or, local businesses would have to pay protection money. In 1903, a dead body was found, folded in half and stuffed inside a wooden barrel in Lower Manhattan. The barrel was soon traced back to an Italian eatery in Little Italy. The cafe was protected by none other than Ignazio Lupo, known as Lupo the Wolf. Lupo was another fugitive from Sicily. In 1900, he had fled to New York to beat a murder rap. He ran a small grocery store in Brooklyn along with his father, Rocco. Lupo was a black hand leader who liked squeezing money out of his fellow Italian immigrants. The Black Hand scheme was an Italian extortion racket that had been around since the mid-18th century. It involved sending threatening letters to a victim. The letter demanded that a specific amount of money had to be left at a specified place or bodily harm, kidnap, arson, or murder would befall the victim. The letters generally contained threatening symbols such as a skull, a hangman's noose, a smoking gun, or a human heart pierced by a knife dripping with blood. They were often signed with a hand, drawn in thick black ink as a warning. Lupo became associated with Giuseppe the Claw Morello and the 107th Street Mob after he married Giuseppe's half-sister. He became the main enforcer for the gang and carried out over 60 murders during a 10-year period. Morello was also on the run from a Sicilian murder charge, this one in his hometown of Corleone. Lupo, now the Sicilian mafia boss in Little Italy, merged his faction with Giuseppe to form what became known as the Morello crime family. At that point, they were the most important mafia family in New York City. The two men shared the overall leadership of the gang, with Lupo in Little Italy and Morello in East Harlem. Other family members were part of the group and had the loyalty of soldiers, such as the top enforcer, Tommaso the Ox Petto. Which leads us back to the doubled-over body in the barrel. A jailhouse snitch up in Sing Sing State Prison identified Petto as the murderer. It seemed that Morello had ripped off a guy in Buffalo. He invited the man down to Little Italy to make peace at the Italian cafe, but things didn't go too well for his guest, and Morello had Petto stab him in the neck. His body was left in the barrel as a warning. At court, no one was brave enough to come forward as a witness, and so Ox, Claw, and Wolf walked away from the incident scot-free with their reputations for brutality intact. Lupo was so feared by his fellow Italian immigrants that they would cross themselves at the mention of his name. Bootleggers. In 1920, along came Prohibition, a nationwide ban on the sale and transport of alcohol. For most Americans, this was an annoyance. For the small-time criminals who ruled their neighborhoods, it was a gift. Despite the ban, the demand for alcohol couldn't have been better, and a black market was quickly created. With supply and demand at an all-time high, the crime gangs became organized overnight. Bootleggers began to ship in alcohol from the UK, Canada, and the Caribbean. Chicago and New York were just two of the American ports where the boats could be met and unloaded. All of a sudden, the street gangs consolidated power and became structured businesses with accountants and lawyers. Those in charge built their wealth to become millionaires who could demand respect. By the late 1920s, two men who were born in Sicily were the most powerful bootleggers in New York. Joe Massaria, who controlled East Harlem, and Salvatore Maranzano, who ran Brooklyn. Each had a gang of young Italian immigrants to help them run their operations. The Sharp-Dressed Man. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Al Capone and his family were doing quite well with their bootlegging and racketeering businesses. Capone, born in New York, was invited to Chicago by Johnny Torrio, an Italian-born mobster who would help to build the Chicago outfit. Known as Scarface, a nickname he hated, Capone had received 3 slash marks on his face while working as a bouncer at Coney Island Dance Hall and Saloon. He went on to become a brothel manager and bodyguard to Torrio. In Chicago, Capone became Torrio's right-hand man and was in prime position for mob boss when Torrio was shot several times over a dispute with a rival crime group. Control was handed over to Capone, who at the age of just 26 inherited an organization of illegal breweries and bootlegging activities that reached into Canada and was protected by law enforcement and politicians alike. Not afraid of using violence to further his career, any establishment that refused to purchase his liquor would find itself on the receiving end of a bomb. As many as 100 people were murdered during the 1920s in such bombings. Despite his reputation as a thug, Capone enjoyed the finer things in life, like cigars, expensive food, drink, and women. He was known for his costly jewelry and custom suits. His friends nicknamed him Snorky, an expression for a sharp dresser. It was Capone's turf war against Bugs Moran and his primarily Irish North Side gang that led to the infamous incident that became to be known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14, 1929, 4 men, 2 dressed as Chicago police officers, lined up 7 members of the North Side gang against the wall of the warehouse, where Moran kept his bootlegging trucks, and sprayed them with bullets. One of the men followed the law of omertá to the letter when, as he lay dying, he told the police, "Nobody shot me." Bad for business. Back in the early 1930s in NYC, 2 factions were fighting for control of the very lucrative bootlegging market, and the bodies were starting to drop. One side was led by Salvatore Maranzano, nicknamed Little Caesar, because of his fascination with all things Roman Empire. The other was led by fellow Sicilian Giuseppe Masseria, who was the head of what is now called the Genovese crime family. He was nicknamed Joe the Boss for obvious reasons, and headed what would later become known as the Bonanno crime family. Don Vito Cascioferro, a powerful Sicilian mafia boss, had decided to send Sal Maranzano from his base in Castellammare del Golfo on the island of Sicily to take control of all operations in New York. And that is how the blood feud got the name the Castellammare War. It was Ferro who explained the subtleties of receiving long-term protection money from a victim. He said, "You have to skim the cream out the milk without breaking the bottle. Don't throw people into bankruptcy with the ridiculous demands for money. Offer them protection instead. Help them to make their business prosperous, and not only will they be happy to pay, but they'll kiss your hands out of gratitude." Ferro would eventually receive life imprisonment for murder in Palermo. Having been arrested 69 times previously and after remaining silent throughout his trial, Ferro stood up after sentencing and said, "Gentlemen, as you have been unable to obtain proof of any of the numerous crimes I have committed, you have been reduced to condemning me for the only one I never committed." In New York, there were violent clashes on the streets as men on either side gunned one another down. Giuseppe the Claw Morello, who had become top advisor to Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, was one of the first men executed in the war by a Castellammare loyalist. In revenge, Joe Aiello, president of the Unione Siciliane, was murdered in Chicago. Although outwardly, the war seemed like a contest for power between Masseria and Maranzano factions, there was a generational conflict going on at the same time. The older Sicilians were known as the Mustache Petes, because of their long mustaches and old-world ideas. The Young Turks were the younger Italian Americans. Born in the USA, they were more likely to do business with non-Italians. Charles Lucky Luciano and Frank Castello, who were Masseria's lieutenants, were part of this younger, more forward-thinking group. They knew that violence and bloodshed of the streets of New York was bad for business, and they had decided to take steps to overthrow their boss. Lucky Luciano and Maranzano made a deal. Lucky would betray Joe the Boss if Maranzano would end the war, give him Joe's rackets, and make him his second in command. On the 15th of April 1931, Joe Masseria and Luciano met at the restaurant Nuova Villa Tamaro in Coney Island, Brooklyn. Legend has it that after a seafood pasta lunch and a game of cards, Joe the Boss was assassinated. Although the autopsy report concluded that he died on an empty stomach. Luciano had excused himself to go to the bathroom before the gunman struck. Joe the Boss received shots to the chest, back, and head. Allegedly, one of the shooters was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. He was one of the founders and leaders of the organized crime group Murder, Inc. Between 1929 and 1941, they acted as enforcement for the National Crime Syndicate, a confederation of criminal organizations that included the Jewish mob and the Italian-American Mafia. Siegel would later become a motivator in the creation of the Las Vegas Strip, along with Meyer Lansky. 2 or 3 men were said to have left the restaurant and got into a stolen car, but this was never corroborated as no witnesses ever came forward. According to the New York Times, the police were unable to learn what happened. With no witnesses and Luciano having an alibi, no one was ever convicted of Joe the Boss Masseria's murder. Death to the Emperor. With Big Joe now dead, at a meeting of crime bosses in Wappingers Falls, Maranzano declared himself the boss of bosses and began handing out territories, whittling them down so that his share was by far the largest. He announced that because of the scale of organized crime in NYC, it would be divided into 5 families. Elsewhere, specifically those in Northeast and Midwest, there would be 1 family for each city. Each family was to have the same clear structure and hierarchy and be headed by a boss, assisted by an underboss. The third position of a consigliere or advisor was not added until later. Capos, short for capo regime or lieutenant, soldiers, and associates. Associates could be from any background and included Jewish hoodlums such as Bugsy Siegel and Maya Lansky. Although he appeared to accept these changes, Luciano was simply biding his time. On 10th September 1931, Maranzano was working in his Midtown office when he was shot and stabbed to death by a team of 3 Jewish hitmen, including Siegel. In the end, neither side won the Castella War. Instead, it was the younger and more cold-blooded generation of gangsters headed by Luciano that were the real winners. And with their rise to power, the American Mafia was set to expand into a multinational corporation. Now, Luciano would lead the way, and first on the agenda was his decision to improve the American Mafia by restructuring to reduce tensions between the factions and streamline the business as a whole. To ensure there would never be another war, he created a ruling board called the Commission, with the heads of each family. The first commission had 7 controlling members that included the Chicago outfit, the Buffalo crime family, and the New York Five. Later, the crime families from Detroit and Philadelphia would be added. The commission also provided representation for Jewish organizations in New York. According to Selwyn Robb, author of 5 Families, it was like writing the Constitution for the American Mafia. The 5 families in New York would be the only permanent members. Members would have an equal say and the right to mediate and vote on important matters, including any disputes between rival families, eliminating the need for the position of a capo di tutti capi, or boss of all bosses. As Joe Bonanno states in his autobiography, A Man of Honor, we revised the old custom of looking toward one man, one supreme leader for advice, and the settling of disputes. We replaced leadership by one man with leadership by committee. We opted for a parliamentary arrangement whereby a group of the most important men in our world would assume the function of formerly performed by one man. All members were to follow the same set of rules. They should have Sicilian roots, everyone in the family must obey the family boss without question, and have the same organizational structure. They had to live by a code of respect for other members, never deal in drugs, and membership was for life. Finally, there was omertá, absolute loyalty and silence to outsiders. In 1931, the New York Five heads were Tommy Gagliano, Joe Bonanno, Vincent Mangano, Joe Profaci, and Luciano himself. The other 2 original members of the commission were Al Capone from the Chicago outfit and Stefano Magaddino, known as The Undertaker. He went on to be the longest tenured boss in the history of the Mafia, leading the Buffalo crime family. However, Capone was sent to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary for 11 years on charges of tax evasion and later retired to Florida, where he died in 1947 due to complications from late-stage syphilis. All roads lead to the same place. Although their golden goose had died at the end of Prohibition, that didn't stop the Mafia from capitalizing on all and any opportunities that were presented. Luciano's goal was to make the Mafia one of the most powerful organizations in America, on par with the US government itself, and any conventional ideologies that were in place for the sake of it rather than to turn a profit was disregarded. Agility was the key to their success. Every political or economic change, whether it was at city, state, or national level, could be exploited. The labor movement flourished with the election of F.D. Roosevelt in 1933. With the new package of labor laws came the right to join a union. That was a perfect opportunity to exploit and control the docks and factories. The Great Depression and World War II brought with them the opportunity to tap into a huge black market of goods. Along with local businesses to extort, illicit goods to traffic, gambling operations and brothels to run, and loan sharking, the Mafia's portfolio of lucrative ventures was diverse and extremely profitable, bringing with it a more than comfortable lifestyle. Joe Profaci's gambling ring in Brooklyn was bringing in $5 million a week alone in the 1930s. Rules were meant to be broken. Luciano's duration as top man had been short-lived, and in 1936 he was imprisoned for operating a prostitution ring. He was deported to Italy on his release. With Luciano out of the picture, next in line for the top job was his consigliere, Frank Costello, and he did so quite successfully for around 20 years. Costello had adopted an Irish name upon gaining his American citizenship in an attempt to make himself seem more legitimate. He liked to schmooze with famous people, judges, and politicians, and became known as the Prime Minister of the underworld. However, all his connections didn't stop him from being dragged in front of the government's Kefauver Committee to investigate improper activities in labor and management, where he was sentenced to 18 months for a refusal to answer questions. The hearings, led by John McClellan and Robert F. Kennedy, centered on corruption in the Teamsters Union and its leader, Jimmy Hoffa. After a bungled assassination attempt left him shaken, Costello retired, and the crown went to Vito Genovese, one-time underboss to Luciano, with Joe Bonanno appointing himself di capo consigliere, or chief counselor of the commission. In the late 1950s, Bonanno saw an opening to make vast amounts of money in the heroin trade, so he broke Mafia rules and set up a meeting in Sicily to discuss an international business of drug smuggling from Europe to the US. The division of labor was divided between the American and the Sicilian Mafia. The Sicilians would bring the heroin into the US, and the Americans would tell them the best places to distribute it to make the maximum amount of profit. During the 50s and 60s, 90% of the heroin coming into the USA was through the Italian-American Mafia. While Bonanno was running his lucrative drug operation, Vito Genovese had become one of the most powerful gangsters in New York after calling a hit on Albert Mad Hatter Anastasia, head of the New York Mangano family from 1951. Anastasia was murdered on the orders of Genovese and Carlo Gambino, who subsequently became the boss of the family. Genovese, flush with his success, decided to hold a Mafia summit, a secret meeting of all the chieftains in an attempt to cement his role as the boss of bosses. The meeting was held in the remote town of Appalachian in New York State in November 1957. Unfortunately, the arrival of several well-dressed men in their expensive cars soon attracted the attention of law enforcement in the sleepy town. After a tip-off to federal agents, the business meeting was raided, and agents captured 58 of the 100 Mafia leaders in attendance. The secret talks meant to elevate Genovese's status had ended in disaster, and it was embarrassing. The names of the families and those involved were all over the media. The secret society wasn't so secret anymore, and there was pressure on the government to bring down organized crime. The Mafia, now public enemy number one, its bosses from across the country were subpoenaed and dragged in front of the committee for improper activities as authorities tried to find links between the mobsters and the unions. During his testimony, Genovese refused to answer any questions, citing his Fifth Amendment rights under the United States Constitution 150 separate times. Our Thing. In 1961, Robert Kennedy's brother John became the 35th President of the United States. In 1962, Robert, now Attorney General, described the Mafia as a private government in charge of organized lawlessness in the United States, with an annual income of billions, resting on a base of human suffering and moral corruption. As a result of his hubris, the Appalachian meeting had brought so much heat down on the Mafia that Genovese ended up in an Atlanta prison for heroin trafficking in 1958. At the same time, another member of the mob was also doing time for narcotics violations in the same prison. Joe Valachi was a low-level mobster who had been sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. Valachi said that Genovese visited him in his cell and said, "Sometimes you buy a barrel of apples, and one of these apples is touched. They're not all rotten, but one of them is touched. That apple has to be removed, or it will touch the rest of the apples, Valachi then said, "Genovese grabbed my hand and gave me a kiss, a suspicious kiss, the kiss of death." Now, believing that Genovese had put a contract on his head for $100,000 in June of 1962, Valachi picked up a pipe left beside some construction work and battered fellow prisoner Joe Beck to death. He wrongly believed the inmate was Joe Di Palermo, who had been sent by Genovese to kill him. After speaking to the FBI, Valachi said he was willing to commit the greatest sin and break the code of omertá if they would give him protection from the mob. The following year, he testified before a congressional committee on organized crime in what became known as the Valachi hearings. And he spilt the lot. He explained how the Mafia referred to itself as Cosa Nostra in Italian, meaning our family, or our thing in English. He described the initiation rituals, the rules, the family structure, and operations. He even named many of the members of the Mafia, and revealed that the current bosses of the New York Five families were Tommy Lucchese, Vito Genovese, Joe Colombo, Carlo Gambino, and Joe Bonanno. Although his revelations never led to any direct prosecutions, the televised trial had exposed the American Mafia to the whole world. Both Genovese and Valachi died in prison. Down, but not out. At the beginning of the 1980s, the Bonanno family were removed from the commission because of the Donnie Brasco affair. Brasco was an FBI agent who worked undercover to infiltrate the Bonanno and Colombo crime families. His evidence led to over 200 arrests and over 100 convictions of Mafia members. Some of those responsible for his introduction into the mob were killed by other mobsters. In 1985, the Mafia Commission trial saw to it that 11 New York Mafia crime figures were charged with drug running, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and criminal gambling violations. This included the heads of the five families. 8 of them were convicted and sentenced, most to 100 years in prison. Time magazine called the trial the case of cases and named it the most significant assault on the infrastructure of organized crime. Rudolph Giuliani, who was a United States attorney at the time, stated, "Our approach is to wipe out the five families." In December of that year, Neil Della Croce, the Gambino family underboss, died, and the Gambino boss and de facto head of the commission, Paul Castellano, was murdered in December. In 1991, a bloody civil war broke out in the Colombo family when acting boss Victor Orena tried to seize power from the imprisoned boss Carmine Persico. With the family split, the commission refused to allow any member of the Colombo family to sit at the table. After 2 years of chaos, 12 members of the family were dead, and Orena was imprisoned. In 2005, Joseph Massino became the first boss of the New York Five families to break the golden rule of omertá. He testified twice for the government to help win a murder conviction against the acting boss of the Bonanno family, Vincent Bassiano. In what was described as the largest mafia operation in U.S. history, the Justice Department issued 16 indictments against Northeast American mafia families in 2011. It resulted in 127 charges and more than 110 arrests. Not only were the five families affected, but also the New Jersey De Cavalcante family and the New England Patriarca family. Author Thomas A. Repetto stated that the decline in the management of the American Mafia was typical of a pattern often seen in legitimate enterprises. After the generation of empire builders and skilled managers leaves the scene, the successors are often mediocre men unfit for their responsibilities and unable to adjust to a changing business environment. The Mafia remains active in the US, where it is still involved in many of its long-established activities, such as loan sharking and illegal gambling. Its hold over the unions has been diminished but not eliminated. Perhaps what has contributed most to the survival of the Mafia is that since the September 11th attacks on America, much of the money and resources spent on the fight against organized crime has now shifted to counterterrorism work.